All right, thank you guys for being here tonight. We're going to go ahead and get started. So first off, welcome. And my name is Dr. Taylor Goodwin. I am a naturopathic doctor. I often get asked, what the heck is that? So we'll start off, I went through medical school and I specialized in alternative medicine. And so that means a lot of tools like hydrotherapy, acupuncture, and what we're going to be talking about tonight, herbs. So I've kind of been into herbs actually since I was a kid. When I was probably 11 or 12, my mom would frequently be pulling me off of other people's lawns and saying, stop eating their stuff. And now I've matured. Now my wife tells me that. So today's session, we're going to go ahead and break it up into 3 separate parts. This is how I usually like to do it. Part 1, anytime we're talking about eating something or using something internally or even on our skin, to be honest, we want to talk about safety. Anything where a small mistake can sometimes have big results, costs, there we go. Then we want to make sure that we're on the safer side, the conservative side of things. Second part, we'll go ahead and talk about 3 local Oklahoma plants that grow here in the Ozarks, as well as most of the parts of the Ozarks, not just Oklahoma. Then at the end, we'll kind of take some questions, we'll talk about some upcoming events, and we'll just kind of casual shoot breeze. So, to start off with, I like to talk about safety kind of with a bit of a story. When I was in undergrad, I started out as an automotive industrial management major, because that's what you're supposed to do when you're going to be a doctor. And about halfway through that, I got an associate's in hating cars, and I changed my degree. But the only time I played hooky during that entire time, well, I guess there were 2. One was to go on a date with my wife, and we made cloaks for Halloween. It was a lot of fun, totally worth it. The other time, though, I had a friend who had connections, and he managed to get a plant walk scheduled with a gentleman named Cattail Bob Seebeck. Cattail was his own appellation, of course. His mother didn't do that to him. And he managed to get so that the plant walk, everyone who would go on it didn't have to pay, and I was like, I am so down for that, forget school. And that was a new feeling, and probably not one I should have imbibed on. But we went and we met on the grounds of a library, so that's probably where this came from, this idea came from. But and beforehand, he handed out a lot of different plants, and one of them, I believe it was hound's tongue. Flavor of that just erupted through the mouth. It was white fire, and he had a good laugh that I actually ate it. And so, but eventually, we went up into some of the Rocky Mountain foothills. And this was around Pueblo, Colorado kind of location, for those who are familiar, southern Colorado. Good plant diversity, nice and green, really awesome to just go through these narrow trails up along the mountainsides. And so we saw really cool things. We saw stonecrop, it's a little moss-like plant, grows on boulders, technically edible, some species. We saw osha, which is an important Native American plant. That one's got some lookalikes that he told us about, that it can look like poison hemlock. It also has a really nice smell. We dug around the root, we just scratched the root just a bit. Everyone else smelled, I think they said licorice. To me, it smells like butterscotch, and so I'm aberrant. No one else smells that except for me, so don't depend on that. But we kept going down the trail, and eventually we came across some tall, yellow-flowered, grass-like strands that were about yay tall. Sweet clover. He started talking about that, how it's got really great nutrition, you can take it, you can make a tea. And then one of our number, because there were a number of us there, one of our numbers said, can you tell us about the ergot fungus? And he's like, well, it sounds like you know about the ergot fungus, why don't you tell us about it? And so the individual went ahead and they started saying, well, you know, back in the 1920s or somewhere around there, there were a lot of cattle that were dying in the fields. And they would be found in a pool of their own blood. And everyone was like, I don't know what's going on. It's been going on since the mid-1800s. But in the 1920s, someone came around and they finally were going to go figure it out. And they tracked it all the way back down to moldy hay bales that had sweet clover in it. And sweet clover would grow a specific kind of fungus called ergot fungus. and it would thin the cattle's blood so much that it would not stay in their blood vessels. So, I tell this story for a few different reasons. Number one, was Cattail Bob Seebeck going to mention that? Maybe he was, maybe he wasn't, but I want to go ahead and make sure that you know, whenever you're going to be using any kind of plants, you want more than one source. If he had forgotten to mention that, that's kind of important. You want to make sure, obviously, never to eat anything with fungus on it unless it's, like something that you were, Greek yogurt, that's a culture that you're doing on purpose. But I have had other herbalists, and I myself occasionally forget to mention something, so you don't want just one off when it's something where you can have a big consequence. So, do your homework, have more than one source. Reason number two, on the way up in those foothills, we passed a plant called Osha. One thing I didn't mention to you is it was endangered. That's why we just dug around the root and smelled it, and then it was just coming out of endangered at the time, so it wasn't against the law to even touch it. If they're in critically endangered status, you don't touch them at all. But with the endangered status of that, we don't want to harvest plants that are having a hard time surviving as it is. There are actually a number of plants in this area that are awesome, great, and medicinal, but they're also endangered. And the reason they're endangered often is because they're great and medicinal. So don't be tempted, otherwise they won't be here. American ginseng, don't touch it. It's having a hard time. Echinacea, we see it on the roadsides. There's plenty. Actually, it's struggling just a little. We just happen to have the beautiful roadside view. That doesn't mean that it's doing that well everywhere. So, if it is responsibly grown, and then they replant it, replant, harvest, totally fine. So you want responsibly, sustainably harvested plants. So you can still use them, just don't harvest them from the wild. Third reason I tell that story, Osha, I mentioned, looks a lot like poison hemlock. Matter of fact, the best way to tell it apart is the smell. You can use a lens and you can use some other technical things, but the smell is the easiest way. Poison hemlock tends to smell like mouse urine, whereas Osha smells like, butterscotch to me and licorice to some other people, and so be wary if you have a damaged nose, I guess, like myself. But the point of this is there are poisonous and dangerous lookalikes. So there is the do your homework on the side of what is safe when we have it identified correctly, but there's also make sure you know your plant. If you misidentify something, all your research doesn't mean anything because you're not using what you researched, right? So those are kind of the three things. One other thing that I'll put on the radar as well is some plants, let me put it this way actually, 70 to 90% of medications, pharmaceutical medications, originally were sourced from plants. It makes sense then that they would have some interaction, right? And so before you take anything that's a medicinal dose, you want to go ahead and consult with your doctor, especially if you're taking medications, or and you want to talk about any conditions you might have to see if there's interactions. Often it is safer, but not always. So herbs aren't 100% safe. Just like getting in the bathtub isn't 100% safe. So, let's see. I think that covers safety. We hit the 1, 2, 3, and then the medications. I do have one special story for today, though, because it's December and the evergreens are out, and they're the only ones that are still there. This is kind of one of those stories where it's the reverse of tooting your own horn. So do not do this. I was in medical school. This is probably 6 years after the previous story where I went on that plant hike, maybe a little more. But I was partway through medical school and it was getting rough, and I was like, all right, I need some extra nutrition. I'm going to go and get myself some pine needles, and I'm going to make pine needle tea. And we're going to learn about that today. But I went and I harvested and I came back and I had a lot of them. And I put very strong, lots for a very strong picture of pine needle tea, and I put it to steep overnight so it would be really strong, because I was like, I need this. Finals are coming, help. Pray to the plant spirits, not really. And then the next day I drank it and I was like, ooh, I should have tasted those needles beforehand. That's more bitter than the pine needles usually are. And then I drank the rest of the cup because I'm intelligent. That evening, I started having just a little bit of pain, and it wasn't super great. Turns out, now it wasn't the pine needle's fault. It was, I harvested it from an apartment complex pine tree. Do you know what apartment complexes do to their plants? Yeah, so I had a really strong infusion, really strong tea of pesticide with a little bit of pine. It was fantastic as an educational experience. I don't recommend doing that. So make sure that if you harvest, do it away from anything that might have been treated.
Roundup?
I hope that that's not what it was. I didn't go and ask them. I just didn't make it again. It became clear in hindsight what had happened, because it's like most pesticides have a very bitter taste. Don't find that out firsthand though. Don't harvest when it is near places that might be sprayed. Don't harvest near railroad tracks. They're allowed to use really strong pesticides there that they're not allowed to use anywhere else, because if a plant comes up and breaks the railroad track, you've seen it come up through asphalt and concrete, plants will go where they want eventually. Then that derails a train, and that's a huge fracas. So it makes sense that they do those there, but stay 30, 40, 50 feet back from railroads. Other places that you want to steer clear, most bodies of water, unfortunately, tend to be polluted these days, and so you want to either do back check and then find out if your body of water that you're harvesting near is clean, or just assume that it's probably not. So, and then the last few places are near heavy traffic on interstates and things like that. If it's a country road, I'm much less concerned, which is, I came from Arizona and I was in the middle of the city where it's like everywhere is heavy traffic. So I might have fudged on that rule, but you saw what happened to me, so don't. Especially on the runoff from those roads when it rains, downhill gets a lot more of the garbage than uphill. So those are some tips really quickly on safety. I could go on and talk about more because I know this is riveting. Any questions though before we go ahead and to the next portion?
Can you review what you mean by sources? Use more than one source.
Sure, that's a great question. So when I say source, I mean a reputable source, a reputable point of information. So an expert botanist, they're going to know how to identify things. They might not know about the medicine side of things, but they're going to know how to identify things. So Green Dean is his nickname. You can find him online. He is a credible professional source who has a great sense of humor. And he knows how to identify things. I have been trained, I'm a doctor, I'm trained in medicine. I would be considered a source for medical things, and to a degree also identification and other things as well. Other sources can be, if you go to PubMed is what it's called, there are a lot of studies that have been done by professionals. So that's on the side of, you can have everything from molecular composition to other things. It's just going to people who have experience, whether it's a clinical herbalist all the way to a laboratory scientist who does it on the cellular level, anything in there. If they're an expert in the field you're trying to learn about, try to have more than one of them. Especially if you're not meeting them in person, where you don't know if maybe they're just thinking about this limited context. But the more passes you have in information, the more likely you are to get a full picture. So I usually go to about, what do I do here? Let's see, I have some sources that come from my medical school textbooks and all those notes. I have those. I go to a botanist, or two or three, and then I go to a few medical databases, and then I might consult another clinician, and that's me hitting several sources. So you can tell I get on my soapbox and set me off. So ask that one again. No, I like it. So I'm kind of a nerd. Sorry, not sorry. Any other questions about safety or research? All right. Moving on to section 2 then. Today we are going to go ahead and talk about these 3 plants. The The first one is, so the other two are evergreens. The first one, however, is not. You actually won't find the leaves that I'm going to show you very frequently. I've noticed that the Ozarks tend to think that they have like 3 springs. It was really fun to see some spring plants coming up right before December, and it's like, oh, you're confused. But Mullien, Verbascum thapsus. This guy, you might find a few of his leaves because of that confusion or maybe eagerness, whatever you want to call it. But in general, this guy is now died back. Why are we talking about it now? Because I was desperate. No. Because, that too. Because this plant has excellent medicine in the root. And the best time to harvest the root is in the period when all the energy has come out of the leaves and the flowers and the stems, and it's stored through the winter in the root.
Spell Mullien.
Mullien, M-U-L-L-E-I-N. So, Mullien is actually an extremely old word. It comes from, actually we're not entirely sure. It's so old that we know it was definitely around in very old Latin. There's different stages of Latin. There's the first, and anyway, we won't go there. But Old Latin, and back then, like Roman soldiers would take the flower stalks, which have very long fibers that are evenly distributed. They'd dip them in tallow, which is kind of a fatty substance, and then they would go ahead and light it. They would have a torch that burned evenly going down the stalk, and they'd had that for a while. Used that long ago. It was also used in medieval Europe as kind of, what would you say, a tradition, where if someone was thinking of their lover and, oh, are they true to me? Do they truly love me? Oh, Mullien plant, will you tell me? And then they'd bend the stalk down towards the house of the one that they were thinking of. And if it popped back up, oh, what delight. Everything was well, they were loyal and strong, and the love would be there forever and ever. But if it fell down, there was probably going to be a tongue lashing that night, because that means something was amiss. And so Mullien's probably responsible for a lot of bleeding ears that were not deserved. But Mullien has a lot of lore all through the ages because it has so many medicinal uses. Matter of fact, it's kind of like 3 herbs in one. And so, coming back around to the word Mullien, I went off herring off after a squirrel. You'll notice that I'm going to catch about 4 squirrels, but I'll chase about a dozen tonight. The word Mullien probably comes from the word mollis. And it's one of the older words in our current English language. It's kind of like a window into another culture because it's so long ago. I'm going to invite all of you to feel this leaf.
I'm familiar with it. I've got one growing in my yard.
I would appreciate that. Thank you.
I've got one of those second, third spring going on.
Yeah? All right. So mollis translates as soft. And so that's why they think that's probably the word that Mullien came from, but we're not really sure. It's just too far gone in history to really draw certain conclusions on that.
Bumblebees.
Yes, they do. It's a little hard to harvest the flowers without, you have to share.
Is it any relation to lamb's ear?
Yes, Mullien and lamb's ear are both the same plant, different name for the same plant. Appreciate this.
Really?
Yes.
Lamb's ear and Mullien are the same?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, say that again.
Lamb's ear and Mullien are the same plant. There might possibly be, yeah.
Mullien grows, and lamb's ear are ground cover.
Depends on the year.
Oh.
So this is a biennial plant. First year, grows low. Second year, shoots up a huge stalk. So also a caveat, diverging after another squirrel here. Whenever you are using common names, meaning lamb's ear, Mullien, versus Latin names, Verbascum thapsus, common names, there's almost always more than one plant called that common name. So there could be, I don't know, 14 different plants that someone's grandmother had always called lamb's ear. And that's just what they called it. So whenever you're using common names, a little bit loosey-goosey, and that's totally fine. Just be sure that you know that. And you want to be like, okay, but which, Verbascum thapsus? Oh no, I was talking about, something else. Make it up. So good question, but this is very commonly called lamb's ear. So now, 3 herbs in one. Let's go ahead and start talking about some of the uses of mullein. So the first use is one that I find most people, if they're familiar with any of the 3 major uses, the 3 major parts, this is the one that they've come across. It's kind of mullein's claim to fame. The flowers, picking them off when they bloom 1 layer at a time, roughly, all the way up the stalk until they finish at the top. And as noted in the back there, bumblebees love them, so be careful, or at least share, And you take those flowers and you put them in oil, usually extra virgin olive oil. Extra virgin makes so it keeps much longer than just straight olive oil. There's a whole bunch of reasons we could talk about, but I'm not going to chase that story. And after 2 to 6 weeks, you'll have mullein oil. Why do we want this? Well, it's analgesic, pain relieving. And it's actually extremely, number 1, gentle and safe. And number 2, because of that, very effective for very young children who have ear infections. And this is what you'll most frequently hear about mullein being used for, is they'll take a few drops of mullein oil and they'll drop it into a child's ear that's having an ear infection, and it'll take the pain away. The oil will absorb in through the mucous membranes pretty easily because it's oil. And the pain relieving qualities will act more quickly than you might expect. So it also is something called spasmolytic, meaning to relax muscles, to undo spasms. Lytic means to break, spasm is seizing of muscles. And so it also helps relax the area, which helps in that direction. Now, you might notice there's something I didn't say. It doesn't actually cure the ear infection. It doesn't kill it. It just takes the pain away. And so frequently, if you wanted to actually do something more than short-term relief, people will add, or should add, it's not always done, but it should be, add some antimicrobial of some kind, like garlic oil. Garlic oil and mullein oil, they're both safe, they're both friendly, and they both go well together. And then you can have a pretty nice, effective thing where all of a sudden the house might sleep that night. So, middle ear infections are when this is traditionally used and has been for quite some time. The one caveat, if there is a ruptured or broken open, eardrum, tympanic membrane, usually that means the child was crying really hard and then suddenly they feel better and it might have popped, all the pressure's gone. So it actually feels better instead of worse. But if it has ruptured, we don't put anything in the ear, nothing. So that little caveat on the side there. But it's been found pretty effective. You can also use its pain relieving qualities elsewhere. And it has been used in that way.
Flowers need to be yellow and fresh?
That's best. Technically, that's a great question. So once the flowering stalk comes up, we'll talk about its life cycle in just a little bit. But you'll see some of them coming off in layers. Once any of them are coming off in layers, at that layer and up, assuming that it's blooming in the correct pattern and everything, basically any of them that haven't bloomed out yet, technically are also good. Blooming is the peak of medicine, but if you took an entire stalk and then took all the ones that were in buds but not open yet, those would also be good medicine. That would be a faster way to do it. Traditionally, they'd go out and pick the flowers that were open at the time, and that is the peak of medicine, but then you have to go out every day because you get about 8 flowers that are blooming each day. So maybe you've got a field of mullein, and then that's plenty, but excellent question. So moving to the second part, anyone want to take a guess? We've talked about the flowers. What other part of mullein do you think might be medicinal?
The leaf.
The leaves.
You mentioned the roots already.
Aha! So the leaves and the roots. We'll go to the leaves first, and then we already have the third one. Apparently I spoiled it without even remembering that I did so. So, the second part of mullein that is medicinal is the leaves. And this is the second most common for people to hear about. And this is actually one that's pretty good. Like, the flowers are good. They're a nice remedy, and I like them. I use the leaves a lot more. The leaves have a number of actions. They are, I'll tell this story and then I'll tell you what they do. So here's a story that kind of illustrates what they do. My wife got sick, and so of course I, as the tender and loving husband, was ecstatic. Because then, hey, hon, you want to try this out? So I made her some mullein tea. She had had a lung infection, lower respiratory tract infection, kind of up into the throat too. And my wife, she is amazing. She has an extremely sensitive sense of taste. And so it's actually extremely variable across the human population, by the way. So some people actually do taste a lot more and a lot more strongly. So it makes sense that it's a little harder. And so when she said yes to the cup of mullein tea, true love. But she was having a lung infection. She was coughing, and she couldn't get all the, the lung gunk up and out, and she was not enjoying that. So I gave her a cup of mullein leaf tea, and she drank it, bless her, and halfway down the cup, she said, oh, two things. Number one, that doesn't taste that bad. Oh, yes, score. And number two, she believes in me, but she usually believes in a distance. No, that's not true. Number two is, she said, and she coughed and she managed to get some stuff up. She's like, oh, I'm starting to feel better. And I was like, yes, all right, score, good husband. All right, thank you. And then she drank the rest of the cup, and that was not, At the bottom of the cup, there was this one little ingredient that I had forgotten about. The hairs fall off the leaf. Easy mistake. Anyone could? Yeah. So don't do that. So mullein leaf, you will want to strain it through cheesecloth or a French press, but it is, in fact, really good for the lungs in 4 ways. So let's talk about those. Number one, we need to understand our lungs a little bit to understand this first one. In our lungs, they're supposed to be kept moist, right? All the way down in there. They're supposed to be a little bit wet. They're not supposed to be a swimming pool. That's called fluid on the lungs, and that's like, it feels like you can't breathe because you can't. It's called drowning. So to get some of that moistness up and out, because we make the mucus to protect it, but then we move it up and out, we have little finger projections on the inside of our lungs called cilia. And they just keep doing the sea urchin dance, and they move stuff up and out. Mullein actually stimulates that, so they move faster, and they get that stuff up and out. And so then you cough it up. That's called to expectorate. There's 2 kinds of expectorants that are commonly heard of. There is a relaxing expectorant. Oh, you're coughing way too hard. That extra coughing isn't helping you get stuff up. You're doing this like, and you keep going until you have no strength left. The first few of those was going to get up what it was going to get up. The rest of that's just over-irritated tissue. So a relaxing expectorant calms that down. You're still going to cough, you're still going to get stuff up, but you're not going to be hacking until your lungs are on the outside. On the other hand, there's that person who's kind of looking like they have either a weak disposition or maybe just a weak cough, where it's like, what's that going to do? I'm sorry, that's not very helpful to actually get stuff up and out. And so for that, you want to stimulate a deeper cough that's actually going to get the job done, get all that bad stuff out. That's a stimulating expectorant. Mullein is in the 3rd category, the one that you don't hear about very often. Not terribly common. Mixed, a mixed expectorant. It brings down an overstimulated cough, and it brings up a weak cough. And so it's really nice. It's just one that you can go out, you grab, you add it to the mix, and it's nice and balancing. And so mullein is a really nice, home herbal to just have out back. It's a very friendly plant, safe, easy to recognize and identify, And it helps the lungs in a number of ways. So we've talked about a couple of them. There's another one though. It also is a lung-centric, so it does it everywhere, but really strongly around the lungs. It's a lymphagogue. All right, well that was a fun word. Lymph nodes might be something that you've heard of. You know, the things that swell up under here about now every year. At least for your kids, maybe. The lymph vessels connect all the lymph nodes, and that's where a lot of our, so we have blood that goes through. Some of that blood goes off to feed the cells. Some of it makes its way back into the blood vessels, but the rest of it has to find another way back into the vessels up here. And it goes through all of the lymph system. And we could talk about that for a while, but basically, it going through the lymph vessels lets it be checked by a lot of our immune system, and that helps us fight off diseases. So think of it as the airport check station. Some people get pulled over and have to go into the deep check, and I feel so bad for you, but you'll eventually make your way back out. So, and that's kind of what lymph and lymph nodes are. So if the lung lymph vessels and nodes get to move more stuff through, they're gonna, number one, find bad guys faster, and number two, mobilize the troops faster. And so this is a lung lymphagogue, which really helps the lungs fight off a lot of nasty things, a little better than they otherwise would. So, it's also a general lung tonic in general, which just means that it generally helps the lungs. So that's the last one. It's kind of a general statement.
Yeah.
So,
I'm remembering someone told me that the leaves are also smoked.
that is true. So some people, so this was more of a traditional use. I haven't met anyone who has actually done this in today's era. I'm sure that some people do, I just haven't come across them. But about 100, in the 1800s and early 1900s, and probably before that as well, it was, people would smoke Mullien leaf when they were having an asthma attack. Not what you would expect. Why? Usually smoking's not good for that, but it, oh, have you?
It does, it works. Yeah, I have asthma and my dad used to give it to me as a kid.
Thank you for sharing that. That's very interesting.
It
So,
went fast too.
interesting. And would you just roll up a leaf and then burn that straight?
Just like it, yeah.
All right, that's fascinating. All right, well, good to have a first-hand account. I appreciate that.
You have to relight it often.
We burn it as
All the
a,
fuzz on
as
there.
a, like a sage.
Yes,
So instead of
Dry.
smoking it, you just light the dried leaf,
Mhm.
and that smoke can fill the room, and you're actually breathing, not the whole thing at once,
Right.
but just kind of like an instant, but a smudge with Mullien.
Okay, awesome. Very interesting. So, I appreciate that. There's, I'll have to go ahead and
No, it was locked. There we
yeah.
go.
So that's one that, yeah, that is definitely another use. So,
Is there a time to pick those leaves when they have their peak effectiveness?
excellent question. So question was, is there a time that the leaves are best to pick? And the answer is yes, they'll be good at any time, but the peak is just before flowering. So I should say before the stalk has become the main growth. So flowering, in my head, I include the entire flower stalk as part of its flowering process. So just to be clear, I don't mean like just when the flowers are coming out. I mean when the stalk is starting to come up. As soon as the stalk is starting to come up, more and more of the energy is being dedicated to that. And so you want the leaves before that, but even then they're still good. So I wouldn't avoid those leaves.
Do they store long? I mean, if I pick a bushel basket of them,
If you dry them and they don't mold, then yes, they'll store about 1 to 3 years dried. You also can get them to last longer if you do an extract with some type of preservative, and that preservative could be vitamin E, it could be alcohol if you do a tincture, it could be a number of other things. Vitamin E is really popular in oils, and then tinctures use alcohol. And those are both natural preservatives. A tincture can last 5, 10, 20 years. So,
What kind of alcohol?
so usually the way that it's done is you get Everclear, 190 proof, and then you mix it with water. For this plant, I don't remember the exact ratio because you have a certain percentage, because you want, so Some molecules are hydrophilic, they like dissolving in water. Some molecules are hydrophobic, they like dissolving in oil. And then a lot of them are somewhere in the middle. When you're doing an extract with a alcohol, water, which is tincture, that's what tincture means, alcohol-water balance. That's not literally what it means, but it's what it means to us. Anyway, I say so much about the origins of words that I was just like, that's not the etymology, all right. But with the Mullien leaf, there's a percentage that would be the best to get out the active constituents, and I don't remember that right now, but it's probably 40% if I had to guess, but don't quote me. So,
That's a whole nother deal when you start getting into oils and tinctures.
yeah.
I'm assuming there's a recipe online somewhere for that, isn't there?
Yeah, you make sure you get it from a good source, because there's a lot of recipes, and then there are a lot of recipes. And then also, for anyone who's interested, I teach that as well. I do medicine making classes, but we'll touch on that later, so.
When you make a tea, you're using the dried leaves or fresh green leaves?
So you can do either. Typically, I prefer, and this is not something that you hear everywhere, but Rosemary Gladstone agrees, you want to use fresh if you can, but dried is good most of the time. There are a few things where, like perilla, you do it dried, it's good for many things, but one of its actions is like, it's just, you're not going to get very much of it because that one is a fresh only. Centella, you want that fresh all the time. Most plants, fresh is best, dry is good.
Thank you.
Not at all. So, and then did I address your question too?
I forgot it.
What kind of alcohol?
Yeah, yes, Everclear, thank you.
Okay.
I was already following that. I must have, I didn't say anything.
You set him off again. All right.
Isn't it 90 proof alcohol is what you tincture with? 90 proof?
Everclear.
190 proof, and then I dilute it down. So Everclear or any of that's a brand, but you know what I mean. Anything that's 190 proof. And then I dilute it down to the correct percent. Technically, you don't have to start with 190 proof, but then you have to do a lot more math to make sure you hit the right percent at the end. And so it's usually most cost effective and simple to use just Everclear. And then you dilute it down to whatever the percent is supposed to be. So if it says 40% tincture, you do 40% alcohol, 60% water.
Well, if you're making tea, you just pour it water.
Yeah, if it's tea, then there is no alcohol unless it's Christmas. No, all right. I actually don't drink, but I make fun of those jokes. All right. So, awesome. So the leaf has many great uses. Make sure you strain it, unless it's someone you don't like. No, strain it even then. The third part of Mullien that has an excellent use is the root. And this is the one that I hear about almost never, because it's just, it doesn't have a whole lot of traditional stories around it. It isn't the part of the plant that you see as you go by, I guess. For whatever reason, I don't encounter people who are familiar with this very often. But the root is actually a very good connective tissue tonic. And that's something that we don't get a whole lot of in our American diets, is stuff that helps the connective tissue. And the connective tissue, what is that? Well, if you have a hernia, connective tissue gave loose. Oh, my joints hurt. Well, just about everything there is connective tissue. Oh, I have injuries that won't heal on my skin. Well, beneath the skin and the epidermis and the epithelial layers and all that, beneath all that, something called the basement membrane. That's what everything's anchored to, and that's connective tissue. And then muscles, they have tendons, and then you also have ligaments between the bones. That's connective tissue. And then, connective tissue is just kind of like the mortar to the bricks. Bricks is everything else in the body, all the other cells, all the mortar in between the bricks, connective tissue. We have it everywhere.
Blood is connective tissue.
Blood technically is connective tissue. Thank you. That one, yeah. I can tell a fellow nerd in the audience. All right. So, yeah, and it's all through us, quite literally. And connective tissue, if you have, joint pain or any of these other things, taking care of your connective tissue generally helps with a lot of other things. Not everything, and it doesn't cure everything, but it's nice to have it kind of up to snuff. And we don't get that quite as readily through our standard American diet. Don't make that an acronym. Oh, wait, you can. All right. So, Mullien root is, it has compounds that help with cross-linking in collagen and other things, and it helps reinforce the connective tissue. Our spines and the discs in there, the discs in the spine specifically, obviously the vertebra are bone, but the discs, that's connective tissue. And so there's a lot of things that it will help with. So that is an action that is not super commonly found, and so it's really kind of fun to find one like that.
And how do you consume that root?
So I believe that this one is, again, you would do an extract. I believe it's 40%, and I would probably do it tincture style. That's how I have worked with it in the past. You probably can do it fresh, and I haven't used it fresh in the past, and so that's not fresh on my mind. But usually, if you're going to use a root, I would guess, so it depends on if it's water soluble or oil soluble is why I'm going here. If it's water soluble, which I believe that it is marginally water soluble, you do thin slices of the root, fresh, and then you would put those in, you'd put about a tablespoon of those into water, and then you'd boil it, not just hot water, this is different than a tea. You'd boil it for 15 minutes,
Right.
and then you do a decoction, is what it's called. And then you would drink that. However, I'm trying to remember if the compounds are fully water soluble, so take all of that with a grain of salt.
Okay.
If it was oil soluble, we'd do something else, but you can always do a tincture extract to the proper percentage, is always your fallback. So
So in other words, the root is not a tea drink.
I would need to check on the solubility. I've always used it as an extract. It could be a decoction, which is basically a fancy tea. But you wouldn't just pour hot water over it, that's correct. It's too tough.
To what?
Too tough. Roots you can't do with, you have to boil roots, any root. They're all decoctions, except for maybe, anyway. Generally they're all decoctions, we won't go there.
I know it's not a one-shot cure. What are you talking about? Weekly, monthly, yearly, a dose of that, daily, or?
So it would be a daily dose, and you would take it for probably, I don't want to get into medical advice, all of this is educational. You would take it probably for something like 6 weeks, but some people take it longer. If they have something like fibromyalgia, I'd probably do it long term. If they have something like an injury they want to have heal, I would do it based on term for that. And then how much? Mullien is a plant that usually you don't do alone on any of its levels. You'll notice the first one we mixed with garlic. The leaves, you'll almost always mix with something else, because Mullien it's effective, but gentle. And so it likes to have companions to synergize with to get the job done well. And then with the root, yeah, it would usually be daily, but how long and how much depends on the purpose of the illness.
You're getting to make a big batch, how long would it last?
If it was a tincture, it would last 5, 10, 20 years. If it was a tea or a decoction, 24 hours. Water breaks things down gangbusters. So if you put it in the refrigerator, you could get 48 hours. And decoctions tend to be a little more resilient because they have alkaloids and things in there. But yeah, once it's in the water, it doesn't last very long. A few compounds do, but most don't.
Do you think that it's more effective than willowort?
That is a very nuanced question. It depends on what you are using it for and what your goals are. I
Mostly,
can't just say yes.
Anti-inflammatory properties.
Still nuanced. I would need the full backstory. I wouldn't just put one ahead of the other. It depends on what's going on.
Okay.
So, thank you for the question, but I can't give you a straight answer. So, awesome. Any other questions about Mullien? So popular today.
To do the root, you'd slice it and then boil it. Right?
Assuming it's water soluble, again, don't quote me on that. I've usually used it as an extract, and so I need to review. I should have done that beforehand, but you know, you always expect people to find the one thing you forgot to review.
But it's taken internally. Taken internally.
Yeah, the root would be taken internally. Again, I can't remember if it's water soluble or not, but in general, water soluble roots, you would do it in that fashion. So I could check on that, and if you email me, my business cards are up there with my email. If you ever want something like this, where it's like, it's just in the back of his head, shoot me an email, and I'd be happy to respond.
Do you have a go-to website to get some quick answers?
Quick answers, depends on which kind. I got about 6.
Is there any case where laying moistened or wet mullein leaves on the chest or on an arthritic joint will topically absorb in and provide relief?
You can have some effect from that, yes. It especially helps if you have some carrier moisture that's going to penetrate through well. And there's also what other herbs you mix it with. Like a mustard poultice is, and that doesn't mean, you know, Heinz mustard, that's not that mustard. That'll really help move it in more, and so there's a number of ways you can get that done. It's possible. Matter of fact, mullein leaf also is being used for bruises and burns and cuts, and they would wrap it around. That was a Native American use, I believe. It's possible that that was a little more modern, but still Native American use.
Thank you.
So, yeah, it's interesting. Usually when you're doing anything topically, you need to have either you need to have it bruised up really well, and it needs to be a little bit moist, and then it needs to be in good contact with the skin.
What about a vinegar?
Usually bandaged over. Vet wrap?
A vinegar
A vinegar?
as a carrier?
That depends on what you're trying to accomplish. That's an option. So vinegar in some senses is helpful for some things and then less for others, but we'll leave that for when we go on one of our in-depth classes. So, I do have some restraint. So, awesome. That is mullein for us. Any other questions on the plant?
Yes, you said that it's soft, so it likes to have companionship. Just name a few without having to go into it.
That it grows with, or that it's used in medicine?
Medicinally, you said it's soft and generally.
Oh,
likes
yes. It's soft and
companionship.
gentle, so I would usually pair this, it depends on what you're trying to do, but if it was a lung infection, say, I would probably pair it with thyme. That would help with the cough. It'd be antimicrobial. I would probably pair it with ginger. That's a circulatory stimulant, gets the herb where it needs to go. It also is antimicrobial to a degree. It also tastes good. That helps people actually take the medicine. That's what I call effective. Cayenne pepper, same as ginger. Those are interchangeable. Honey, that's antimicrobial. Depends on which kind you have. Makes it taste better. I always try to go for the ones that taste good. Those are a few.
Okay, so if you make the tea and you add honey, you made companionship there.
Yep, that would be a very gentle one. I'd probably, depend if it was a mild cold, that'd be great. If it's something more than that, I'd probably toss in a few more.
Okay.
So, and then you always want to have it multiple times a day. 1 cup a day when you're acutely sick. That's helpful, but don't expect it to help you kick it too rapidly. So, awesome. Let's go ahead and move on.
Sorry.
No, I like this.
Mullein is effectual for the digestive or the excretory, as in constipation situations?
So, that's not one that comes flashing to mind. I could check my notes and see if there's something buried in there. It's not one that comes on my top list for that particular problem, but that you can use herbs in dozens of ways, and so you can't memorize everything. So, all right, good question. Next, we have pine, this exotic plant that no one has seen. All right, so contrary to what lots of people might expect, including myself at first, some years ago when I was first doing this is actually the first plant I presented on, or at least it was in the first presentation. It was plant number 3, but what was that, like 15 years ago now? And since then, I have learned more of the lookalikes. You can get this guy pretty quickly, but once you start to really look at it, you find there are a few relatives that aren't, well, they're either relatives or they look like they should be, that you can get them confused with. We're going to go ahead and talk about those too. But pine, how many people have heard of Ewell Gibbons? There's some happiness.
The elders in the crowd.
So, well, I've heard of him too. He had a fun commercial in the 70s, I think it was, with Sonny and Cher, and they gave him a pine wood plaque, and he got famous for saying, "Have you ever eaten a pine tree?" And then he bit the plaque, And it turned out it was made of cake fondant because it was a joke. He got famous years before that for saying, "Have you ever eaten a pine tree?" So they were joking with him. And probably advertising for something, but who remembers that? Ewell Gibbons, he grew up in a very poor family, and so they had to forage literally to make ends meet, you know, like sustenance-wise, calorie-wise, survival-wise. And so he learned to eat and forage wild edibles quite a bit. And pine trees indeed are a very good survival food. So good and dependable that they have actually been used not just for decades, but centuries, probably millennia, as a survival food. Native Americans, some of them would eat it all the time, but many tribes would use it when winter came on and something had happened, they hadn't been able to gather enough to go ahead and survive through the winter, and they had to do something. Maybe their tribe grew too much, maybe something else. And they would turn to the pine tree, and they'd take off the outer bark, and then they would strip vertically, not horizontally, horizontally kills the tree, vertically, the bark out of there. And there are sugars contained in that inner bark, known as the cambium. And they would take that, and they would grind it into powder, and then they would make cakes out of it. Alternatively, they also could soak it in water and get the sugar to dissolve out and drink that. And this would get them through the winter. Excellent survival food. So of course, Ewell Gibbons, with his upbringing, was familiar with that. And that was kind of one of his core and favorite plants. There are, however, a plethora of other uses with the pine tree. Matter of fact, I think I went 35 minutes overtime last time because I kept going on the pine tree. So I will try not to do that today, but we'll be a little faster. The pine needles are really well known as kind of a trail side nibble. Now, caveat, let me say this first, backing up to safety. So all members of the pine genus, P-I-N-U-S, Pinus genus, that genus, those are edible, but there are other things that some people call in common, like, oh, that's the Australian pine. That's not technically a pine tree. So you need to know that it's a true pine before you know it's edible. So just need to say that. But all of them that are in the pine genus are edible, and you can identify those. Oh, I guess I do that. Maybe we'll learn how to identify Mullien at the end of this, but let's go into identification of the pine tree, and then we'll go into all the rest of it, because we're going in whatever order we go in today. At the base of the pine needles, you're going to notice that there is a little wrap going around the group of needles. Now, the needles are grouped 2 through 5. Some pine trees, softwood pine trees, have 4 or 5. Harder wood pine trees have 2 or 3. One pine tree in particular, the pinyon pine, has only 1 needle, but we're going to leave him off to the side. For safety's sake, if you see something that has this sheath at the base, it's called a fascicle, and multiple needles inside of it, then you have a pine tree. So, why do we care? Next, the pine needles actually are really good. Yes, the wrap right here, that brown thing around the needles there. And that's called the fascicle.
It's connected tissue. It's connected tissue.
It's kind of the tree equivalent, sure. We'll go there. So, the pine needles, they are high in vitamins A, which doesn't dissolve in water, so you're not going to get it from a tea, but also C and E. And C is very readily dissolvable in water, and it actually has more, ounce for ounce, than oranges. So vitamin C is pretty punchy in there. It's also got something called shikimic acid. And for any people, I once had a pharmacist in the audience, and yeah. How many of you have heard of Tamiflu? It's a product on store shelves. Well, the crude ingredient of Tamiflu that they package all these other things around is shikimic acid. So when the flu virus comes into us, he's like this. He's got a bunch of he's a sphere, he's a ball, he's got a lot of projections coming out, and they basically are sticky on the end. So he's going around looking for something to stick to, and then suck himself inside. And then we're sick. And then he replicates and makes more, and he repeats it. Tamiflu or should I say shikimic acid, basically takes a tennis ball and sticks it on the sticky bit, and so then he just bounces off. His little grabber is now occupied. And so he'll float around inside of you, but he won't actually get in the cells. And so this isn't for every virus under the sun, but for some viruses, influenza among them, pine needle tea is antiviral, not in the sense that it kills it, but in the sense that it deactivates it. And fun little side fact, while it's deactivated, your immune system can still hunt it down, find it, and then get trained to kill it properly. And so it's like, it's almost like a free vaccination without anything else, you know, it's great, the natural way. Pine needles are usually prepared when you go on a trailside hike. You can nibble on some of them. It's actually kind of fun. No pine tree tastes the same. Even the same species. You go from one pine tree to another and you can get bitter, you can get astringent, you can get sour. They always have pine as a strong flavor. Fair warning. But once I got one that was lemony, just a little bit sweet, and it was like, I'm remembering this pine tree. And I went back there, and it was all my favorite.
Okay, what part of the pine needle are you chewing on? The part that has the collection at the base?
The green. So I would take the green needles, and I would, I being me, would actually chew on them and swallow them and enjoy them. Most people, who are not me, they go ahead and take the needles and then bruise them up, bend them up so that they're a little damaged, they'll leak a little, and then they put them in water. Either, if you're on a hike, you just stick them in your thermos, and then, you know, half an hour later it's a room temperature water infusion, so it takes longer. But the longer it's in there, the more like pine it'll taste, and you get more of your electrolytes back, and it's nice. Or, if you have actual hot water, a little bit below boiling, it'll go faster. That does damage a few of the more sensitive nutrients, but not enough that you need to stress about it. It's still great.
But don't boil it. But don't boil it.
If you boil it, then you're going to damage a lot more. So pine needles have got a good reputation for a number of reasons there. They also have one other compound that's pretty cool. It's called alpha-pinene. Alpha-pinene is one that they have done studies on for people who have Alzheimer's and dementia or anxiety. And they have found that just being exposed to the smell of alpha-pinene helps calm anxiety down. And for some people, also helps with memory modestly. It's not like a cure-all. And so it's interesting that back in the medieval ages, there were some people who were in mental institutions after going to war, I would suppose, and they had, you know, PTSD basically, and they would enclose them, and it's like, let's keep you away from all stimulus, and that's going to help. And it's like, you know, to a degree, but then eventually they had another idea. And they took them out to the countryside, and they found, it's written down in all their records, it was like, many of them made full recoveries, or at least made a lot more progress. And I always found it, now this is not a scientific study because it's the way that they did it, you know, a long time ago, but I've always found it interesting that they took them to the countryside. Lots of trees, open, and they had interaction with people. There's a lot of different things going on, not just alpha-pinene floating in the air. But country air being healthy turns out to be true because of many things, everything from bird song, which actually has been studied, like, you can study anything. If they heard two different birds, if they heard two different birds, then they felt this much better. And if they heard four, it's fun to read some of these studies. It's like, I both wish I was part of your team and wonder how you got funding at the same time.
So you could put pine oil in your diffuser.
Exactly. Yeah, and so they found that just the scent, even when you're removed from the trees, does many of the things. They also have found that, not specific to pine trees, but in general, congratulations to everybody living here, being in the countryside and going on walks near trees and all of that kind of thing affects blood pressure, affects sense of well-being, affects inflammation, affects blood vessel support and things like that. There's a lot of benefits. And I actually used to prescribe, back in Arizona, when I lived in the big city, I used to prescribe, go to this one little nook where there's a little river preserve, and there are actually trees there. They do a better job than that. They have some parks. But there was one that was really nice, and I prescribed going and walking there for anxiety, because it makes a difference.
Oh, forest bathing.
Thank you. Yes, beat me to the punch. And the joke is, don't actually go bathing unless no one's there. Okay, no. So yeah, forest bathing is what that is typically called.
I've been told that our pine tree is the loblolly pine. Is that a real pine?
I believe I've heard of that. I am not an expert on differentiating species. I usually get it down to the genus, and then I call it good on pine trees. So I know the pinyon pine and a couple others, but
I've
can't
heard
help
that
you.
most of them here in the Ozarks the loblollies do real well. If you go to Clinton especially, what are the loblollies for this
Okay.
area?
Excuse me. Good to know. So they say that if someone sneezes, then a truth was said. So there we go. Awesome, good stuff. Couple other things on the pine tree really quick, and then we'll move forward because I don't want to do the same thing again. I kind of do, but I shouldn't. The pine nuts, they actually come from pine trees, go figure. But most pine trees, their pine nuts are minuscule. They're like mustard seed, you know, the biblical grain of mustard seed. They could have said a pine nut. It's tiny. The pinyon pine and a few others have the large nuts. If you're ever in a survival situation, calories that you get out of that will not be worth it, so go somewhere else, go for the bark. But you can lay out pine cones on a tray, put them in your oven, heat, and they open up, and then you can whack them out. So knock yourself out, roasted is best. And then, let's see, there's a bunch of other things from pycnogenol, super expensive supplement, amazing for a bunch of things like blood vessel support and memory support and lipids and blood sugar. That actually comes from pine bark extract. And you can save money by having pine needle tea instead of pycnogenol. I mean, pycnogenol is good too, and sometimes you need it concentrated. Awesome. But, and then the last one, I couldn't help myself. We have to name everyone even if I speak really fast. So, the strobili, the little male pine cones that are bendy, they're called strobili. Microsporangium strobili. But those guys, you might have parked under them one day and then left to go to the grocery store and come back and found that you now own a yellow car. Pine pollen. So that was actually used by the Native Americans as well. They valued it. They would put a pouch around it, knock it off into it, and then they'd stave it until a day of battle. And then they would quaff it. They would just throw it in under their tongue. They wouldn't swallow it because the digestive juices break it down quite a bit and it's not nearly as potent. But they would just hold it under their tongue and then eventually swallow, of course. And it has a precursor to testosterone that our bodies are able to convert into testosterone. It's not enough that it's something that's like hormone warning, but it was enough that you would get, and still can get, more of a boost of stamina and strength for the day. And so when they were going to battle and they were going to be going for a while, or if they were running between tribes and they wanted to run the whole way there, they would use that for more energy. And that checks out with modern studies. So lots of uses of the pine tree. Any questions on this guy before we move on? All right. Sorry, Mullien's more popular. All right. So next, we didn't talk about lookalikes. Well, good thing we're talking about the lookalike. So
It looks like you.
that is another lookalike. This one is juniper.
Juniper.
Some people call it cedar. Technically, it is in the juniper family and genus. It is not a cedar, it's not a true cedar, but it gets that name because the way that the fronds look is similar to a true cedar. True cedars have kind of a two-dimensional, it looks like this except flat, so it's like this, all the fronds are in one plane, kind of like that. But these guys, junipers, if I bring this juniper around and the pine, you might notice needles don't branch. These fronds on the juniper do. So that's a good way to tell them apart, besides what I already told you about with the fascicles.
It's like a miniature tree on its own.
Yeah, it's Charlie Brown's Christmas tree. So junipers, they actually start with little things that look like needles, but they're single needles and not grouped, and they don't have a fascicle. Well, if they start as needles, how do they end up like this? The next needle grows out of the first one. And then it keeps doing that. Someone has some Baki
I'm
nerdiness.
sorry.
No, it's great. It makes me so happy. Makes me not feel bad going into all the details. So, and so this becomes scaly because each of the needles splits the previous one. And so then you have these fish-like scales, if you want to think of it that way. Or you can think of some other kind of scale, if you don't like fish, but fish are good for you. So, the scaliness is something that can really help you identify these. Now, there is another safety concern with these guys, though. Now we can tell them apart from pine, but the thing is, not all junipers are safe. You can figure out that it's a juniper, but telling one juniper from another is difficult. It goes into things like vein placement and stomata. And so I'm not going to go into that. It would take me too long, and I frankly would have to go into enough detail that I would have too much fun. So this one I was requested to speak about, and I think it's really great to speak about it because right now is evergreen season. But I encourage you, if you're going to use juniper, don't harvest your own unless a professional is there. Some are toxic, some are not. If you go and get it from the store, Juniperus communis, or common juniper, always do the Latin with it, Juniperus communis, that's a good one. That's usually the one you can find, and feel free to go ahead and use it. And I'm going to talk about some medicinal uses, but again, not all junipers are the same. Some are safe, some are not, okay? All right.
So that juniper, that's native to Oklahoma? Because, we have eastern red cedar right here that's invasive species.
That's a great question. I've only been here since March. I haven't memorized all the ones that are native and all of that kind of difference, but I do know that Juniperus communis is not invasive, and it does grow throughout most of the U.S., and it should be around here, although, to be honest, I haven't seen it, but I'm sure it's around somewhere.
It likes drier places, right? Whereas the red cedar really likes that moist, loamy soil.
That sounds accurate. I believe Juniperus communis likes a little bit drier. That's where I tend to have seen it more. So that bears out. But one other look-alike between both of these guys is something that was mentioned back here, a yew tree, Y-E-W. That has a single needle, it's wide, and all the needles are lined up like if I was putting them down in a row, and so all these wide flat needles are all in the same plane, they just go pop, 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 pop. They're not like coming out from 50 different angles, there's two. They're all apart from each other, or opposite from each other. The yew tree was used back in medieval England for making archery bows, and they found out archers don't live that long, and they couldn't figure out why. Yew trees are toxic. And so holding that wood day after day and practicing was enough that it affected their longevity, and they would die younger than other people. So yew trees, not edible. So you want to be able to tell those apart from these guys. All right. Does a yew tree have a fascicle? No. How many needles does it have? Just one, not 2 to 5. No scales. Although this guy we're going to be doing that other safe way anyway, where we're going to purchase or have an expert there. So any questions on any of that? Because those ones are sometimes a little confusing. Okay, great. So I'll tell you one fun fact about the yew tree, and then we'll go back over here because you know why, because I always do it anyway. The yew tree has a red berry. It's technically called an areole because it holds the seed like a bowl. And the seed is great in murder mystery novels because it'll give you all the symptoms and effect and end result of a heart attack. It's great. My sister writes books, so how can I kill this guy? Oh, okay, now let's do this one. I had a rough day. You should do both of these. No. But to just make that even better, worse, I don't know. The berry part, that's actually edible. And so it's like, thanks. So yew trees are really confusing, but some fun facts there. Coming back to juniper. Juniperus communis. This one is actually not Juniperus communis. This is another one. Juniperus communis actually has one thing that does help you identify it, but it has other plants that also mimic that. So again, this doesn't get rid of the previous rule of the safety of having an expert. But Juniperus communis is one of the few junipers that never has scales. It stays in the juvenile needle stage forever. And so it just has that initial needle, and then it never goes into scales. Why, or how has juniper been used? Why are we talking about it? Well, aha! Someone knows the good stuff. The juniper berries usually are dark blue or purple, and they're coated with this powdery fungus, basically. It's a microbial growth that's on the outside, and back in the medieval ages, they figured out, hey, we can make cheap medicine by taking this fungus and this berry, and it helps with urinary tract infections. It also ferments really well, and so they put those two together, and then everyone needed medicine. And there was something called Gin Street. And Gin Street became such a big problem in London and a few other major cities that they finally were like, all right, this is the 1920s, prohibition, no more alcohol, there is now a gin tax, no more. And there was a riot, and it was a big thing, and it's really fun. You can chuckle over a history book anytime, like a normal person. I recommend that portion of history, it's very entertaining. But yeah, so you can make gin out of the berries because they've got that culture already on them. You can also use it to get sourdough going and other things. No guarantee on exactly how it'll taste because every strain is going to be different. You find a good one, you keep it, and that's how it's always been. So, but the berries also, you can take a good tablespoon of them, roughly 6-ish, something like that, and you crush them and then make an infusion out of them. So you make a tea out of the crushed berries. Technically they're cones, but whatever. And then you drink that down, and it helps clear out the urinary tract because it makes you pee a lot more. And then that makes all of them feel like they have to hold on to dear life as you're making a lot of fluid go through. And so that's a good way to go ahead and get things so they clear out. But there was another use. There's a number of other uses, but we'll talk about one more, and then we'll go ahead and end. The Native American Pueblo Indians, that was the tribe name. Pueblo means village or city. And that was the appellation of this tribe. The healers of that tribe, at least some of them, we don't know if it was all of them, it's kind of spotty, but some of them believed that the only herb that they needed to affect their trade, for lack of a better term, their work, was juniper, the frond and the berries. They would have them in a pouch. And they would travel around, and whenever someone was sick or ill or needed a medicine man or woman, then they would go ahead and open up the pouch, and they would use everything else around them. They would count on everything else around them, is what I understand. Again, countings are a little sparse. And then they would take the berries, and they would, I believe, make them into incense. Somehow the smell would be brought out, and I believe that was probably through burning or smudging. And that was believed to be purifying and just generally uplifting and energizing. And this was the one medicine that they felt like they needed with them. If everything else could be found, they would use what was there, but this is the one that they would bring with them. Now, the modern scientific reason for all of this, we don't know yet. This is one of the times where we could say tradition helps us look in new places and find things that other people who are wise and did it for a reason can share with us through time. And there have been a number of times that that is borne out. There was an herb, Sarracenia, awesome for fighting off herpes viruses, better than anything on the market until it's going to come out on the market. Eventually there's a good product being made for that. I'm not involved with it, but I know about it. Anyway, but tradition has led us in ways that we haven't seen before. Occasionally tradition does end up being mistaken too, which is why we like having both sides, scientific and traditional. And so with the juniper, we have some on the scientific, we have some on the traditional, and we have some yet to explore and experience. So with that, I'll go ahead and close on these herbs. And and then I'll go ahead and talk about a few of the events that we have coming up. So thank you guys for coming tonight. If you enjoyed this, which I hope you did, unless it was just me up here, then I'm very sorry. So, but not sorry enough that I won't do it again. But if you did enjoy yourself, there's a newsletter that's on the stand up there next to the sign-in, and you can grab those, and it's got some details, but I'll give you a few quick hits. This month, I'm doing a deep dive, herbalism, or more like a health topic this time. It does touch on herbalism, but it's more like a naturopathic health topic, where we talk about chronic inflammation. Where does it come from? Why is it here? What does it affect? Why do I have brain fog all the time, joint pain, and all these other things? What can I do about it? And so we're going to go into a deep dive on why that's rampant through America. That's a paid class that's coming up. There's various dates that are on the website. I think the one that's nearest here is Sparrowhawk Village this coming Tuesday at 2 p.m. And then again at Sparrowhawk, and this one's not yet confirmed, so I guess I'll tell you the one that is confirmed, up in J, 3rd Saturday at 10 a.m. So those are two different ones. And those are found on the website. Go ahead and sign up there if you'd like to. And next month we'll have another workshop, which is Foundations of Health, where we talk about various cornerstones of health. I'll give you more of a rundown on that next month. Remaining things, in February, we're starting an 8-course once a month for 8 months, an 8-session course called Foundations of Herbalism. And that is learning to think like an herbalist and be able to have some confidence in being able to make your own formulations and things. There's a number of other things that are also going on. Feel free to see the newsletter for more details. And if you are interested in signing up for any of those, please just let me know here or go on the website. But that's what I have for you right now. Thank you guys for coming.
I have a question.
Sure.
Would you do something like this again here at the library?
Oh, excellent
Where you
question.
do 3 more different edible and medicinal plants?
As a matter of fact, thank you. As a matter of fact, this is a monthly event where I go over 3 new plants every month, and it is always on the first Wednesday at 6:30 of every month
What
here
are
in
you
Tahlequah.
thinking for your next 3?
My next 3 are going to be potted plants because everything outside is winter. We're going to go over basil, rosemary, and ginger, I think are the 3.
Wow.
So, wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good to meet you, Mike.
Jason.